Yeah, hi, eBay customer support. Hi. This is Josh Gellers. I wanted to process a complaint. I ordered two live dragons, but then when I made the purchase, all I got were two stuffed animal dragons. So I think this is false advertising. Okay, well, you have my credit card number on file. If you could please I'll return it. If you could just give me the money back, that'd be great. Okay. All right, thank you. Bye. Hello, and welcome to Module 6, Lecture 14. This module is focused on international organizations and international law, and that's going to be the focus of today's lecture. So we're going to circle back for a moment to international norms because that will help us to set the stage for a discussion about the role of international law and international organizations in international affairs. So remember, international norms are expectations that actors hold about normal international relations. And remember what the most important international norm was? Sovereignty, right. So violations of norms are seen as immoral. They are deviations from what the international community views as being acceptable. Once they are institutionalized, once enough actors believe that they're important and that they should be followed, they become habitual. People, or rather states, practice them, they gain legitimacy, and then this makes future violations completely discredited. So the example that I gave from the past is sovereignty and also respect for international treaties. So over time, if we're looking at the difference between different international relations theorists, states follow norms not for material reasons, like realists or liberals might believe, but for reasons related to identity, as constructivists argue. So it might be possible that in the initial stages, a country may sign on to a treaty or may abide by the terms of sovereignty in order to gain some kind of compensation, whether that's material, financial, or otherwise. But over time, when the financial or material implications are reduced, states just kind of endogenize these practices and it becomes woven into the fabric of their identity. And that's why it's so important to understand what kind of international norms there are, what is the status of those international norms, how do states treat violations of international norms, and what kinds of international norms are emerging on the horizon. So, international organizations are organizations that, among other things, work to promote international norms. And IOs include both intergovernmental organizations, so those organizations that exist to work among states, and non-governmental organizations, which largely exist outside of formal state apparatuses. So examples of intergovernmental organizations include the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. And there's lots of NGOs, but some of the ones you might be more familiar with are the International Committee for the Red Cross and Greenpeace. And if we want to understand the influence and prevalence of these kinds of organizations over time, we can look at the data. And so in this figure, it shows the number of countries in the world and compares that to the number of intergovernmental organizations. And as you can see, that right about the point at which we came out of World War II, there was this dramatic exponential expansion in the number of intergovernmental organizations throughout the international system. So much so that they grew to outpace the number of countries that even are existing in the international system. This is an important thing to remember, that we now have a larger number of IGOs than we do actual states in the international system. So let's continue to shift along to international law for a moment. International law has many different sources. Where do we derive international law from? Because it's not the same thing as domestic law, right? Our domestic law is embodied in codes, in domestic laws, in constitutions. Yet at the international system level, we're able to pull from lots of different sources, and this is what some argue as a strength of the international legal system, while others might argue that this is actually a weakness and that we can't really pin down in a firm sense where international law comes from, what constitutes international law, what things should be excluded from the purview of international law. But in general, we have things like treaties between countries, customs, which are kind of practices that states engage in, general principles of law, and even legal scholarship. So that's kind of interesting too, right? Because here you have the work of scholars anywhere in the world, and judges can incorporate the writings of legal scholars, which are oftentimes faculty members who are working at law schools, to better understand laws, to help develop the body of international law. But again, for reasons that we'll talk about in a little bit, this may not be something that is greeted with open arms by everyone who's observing the development of international law. Of these different sources, treaties are the most important. They are binding on states, which mean that states are obligated to follow them once they sign on to them. The UN Charter is one of the world's most important treaties, although it at the time only represented the interests of some states, and certainly not all of the states in the international system. Today, it's widely viewed as one of the most important international treaties, and most countries in the world have signed on to it. And another important treaty or series of treaties are the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which deal a lot with war, conduct of war, humanitarian responses, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. We'll kind of unpack that idea. Now, importantly, how do we know that international law is actually something that states will follow, right? We say that they're binding, but what does that mean in practice? Well, as we've talked about before, the international system is marked by anarchy, right? Which means that it's not chaos, but that there's no central authority that tells all the states what to do. So in effect, there's no world police. Enforcement, however, in the case of international law, depends on the power of states themselves on a kind of horizontal basis. So in this sense, the enforcement of international law depends heavily on one of our three principles that we covered in the first lecture, the reciprocity principle, right? This system of punishments and incentives to compel certain kinds of action. And punishments in particular may come in the form of reprisals or sanctions. So things that countries do in order to send a signal that these violations are not just, they're not warranted, and they should be swiftly punished, so that we can rein in what the expected behavior is of states, which again feeds into this larger idea about international norms. So in the context of the United States, and this is by no means to say that the US is the only country that has this kind of a perspective, but the recently deceased Justice Scalia was very strongly opposed to the incursion of international law in our domestic legal system for reasons related to democracy. So I'm going to read this quote and then just kind of summarize its importance to the role that international law plays in governing the international system and how international law is treated by countries at the domestic level. So Scalia in Sosa v. Alvarez Machain says, "We Americans have a method for making the laws that are over us. We elect representatives to two houses of Congress, each of which must enact the new law and present it for the approval of a president whom we also elect. For over 2 decades now, unelected federal judges have been usurping this lawmaking power by converting what they regard as norms of international law into American law. Today's opinion approves that process in principle, though urging the lower courts to be more restrained. This court seems incapable of admitting that some matters, any matters, are none of its business." So what Justice Scalia is saying here in this quote, this excerpt from this court case in 2004, is that unlike law that we make here in the United States that has to go through these democratic processes, when judges who are unelected decide to bring in the ideas of judges from other countries, or especially in the case of legal scholars who are writing in law journals, that is not conducted through a democratic process. And so this is something that constitutional law scholars have been debating, as well as democratic theorists. So what is it that law does to, or how does it intersect with sovereignty in practical ways? Well, we have laws that govern diplomacy, right? The ability of states to interact with one another and to pursue certain mutual objectives. Diplomatic recognition defines the status of embassies and ambassadors. So we know that the United States has relationships with some countries where it has an embassy in their capital or a consulate in a non-capital city, and it puts ambassadors in those locations who represent the interests of the United States. And those embassies, while they are on foreign soil, are actually considered to be the territory of the United States. So foreign law does not intrude on the law that is relevant in an embassy or a consulate in another country. It kind of exists as a little bubble within a country in which it's placed. Then there's another important concept, which is diplomatic immunity. Diplomatic immunity means that diplomats are beyond the reach of host countries' national courts. And so, for example, if someone is a diplomat visiting the United States, they're here for a meeting at the United Nations, and they get in trouble for a minor thing like a parking ticket or speeding ticket, or in some cases even more severe kinds of crimes, the United States does not have the jurisdiction, in most cases, to adjudicate and then punish that individual because of our relationship with the country that that person represents. So in many cases what happens is that person has to go back to their own country, and the United States certainly hopes that the other country prosecutes that individual if the crime is deemed of some kind of severity. What this also has the effect of doing is facilitating espionage activities. So say the United States captures or identifies that someone who is a diplomat from a foreign country is engaged in spying. Well, the individual who's caught spying has to be prosecuted under the laws of the home country, not the host country. So again, that individual has to be sent back, and the United States will probably strongly press that other country to see that that person is punished for violating the relationship that the United States has with that country. Breaking diplomatic relations means withdrawing one's diplomats from a state and expelling that state's diplomats from one's own state. If you saw the movie Argo, you saw that this occurred in the 1970s when the United States cleaned out its embassy in Iran and broke diplomatic relations, formally speaking. It was only until recently that the United States, under President Obama's time in office, decided to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. So we've seen it kind of work both ways over the course of the past several decades, that you can break off diplomatic relations when the relations are going sour, or you can reestablish diplomatic relations when you want to improve and regularize or normalize relations between countries. Shifting a little bit away for a moment from diplomacy and into war, we have what's called just war doctrine, which is governed by international law. These are laws that talk about the role of states in times of warfare, and they fall into two categories: laws of war, or whether it's okay to go to war, and that's known as jus ad bellum, and laws in war, or the conduct that states engage in while they're actually in the battle, on the battlefield, and that's jus in bello. For laws of war, international law distinguishes between just wars and wars of aggression, although it's still up for debate as far as what kinds of distinctions are being made between just wars and wars of aggression, because oftentimes we see that the answer is really in the eye of the beholder, and it's very subjective on occasion. So if a country, for example, feels an imminent threat is posed by another country, and that other country has been rattling the sabers of warfare and indicating that they might actually engage in aggressive actions against another country, well, would it be permissible for that country that is the subject of those threats to engage in a preemptive strike? This is something that is not wholly settled by international law, but in general, what you would need is some discussion among members of the international community, like in the United Nations, for example, to discuss whether there's some kind of threat, a legitimate threat to international peace and security, and if so, does that mean that the international system should get together to address this? Unilateral individual country decisions to engage in warfare are probably going to be greeted with less embrace by the international system than if the acts are deemed to be illegitimate or very clearly acts of aggression that flout international law. And then we're going to continue moving along the trajectory of describing how international law intersects with aspects of governance in the international system by talking a little bit about, it's sort of a micro module, if you will, human rights. Human rights, as you can clearly tell, relate to two words, right? Humans and rights. So we need to know who is human first and foremost if we are to understand who the referent objects are of human rights. To whom should human rights be bestowed upon? So scholars have talked about this at great length, and what we do have some idea of is that being human means that there's certain special qualities that are unique to the human species that warrant special protection. So I usually ask my students what they think these kinds of qualities might be. And you might say things like language or emotion or the ability to go to war or the ability to feel empathy, the ability to love. There may be all different kinds of qualities that you might associate with being human. But where this idea of humanness is kind of frustrated is where we have deviations from it. So just to provide an example, if someone is clinically brain dead, that is that they are hooked up to a machine, they're no longer responsive to external stimuli, and the only thing that's keeping them alive is some kind of medical equipment. If we look at whether someone can think independently or someone can feel emotions, would that person still be considered human? Most people might say yes, but if we went just by our laundry list of qualities, some people might be inclined to say no. So there are instances in which it becomes more difficult to assess whether these are the only criteria that establish whether someone is human or not. And then we even have a discussion within the environmental politics literature as far as what human rights should be extended beyond the realm of humanity into nature itself. The Constitution of Ecuador grants rights to Mother Nature, not humans, but it allows humans to speak on behalf of Mother Nature. And that's a very innovative idea that kind of pushes the concept of human rights even further. So the other side of this, of course, are the rights themselves. And these rights basically adhere to several different kinds of categories. They're entitlements. I am being provided something by virtue of me being a human. Immunity, it means I should be free from something that occurs. Privilege, these are something I am granted because of my status as a human or some other kind of person. Occasionally, constitutions will specify that certain rights adhere to children or women or citizens only. So these are specific privileges that are given to different kinds of individuals or classes of individuals within a society. And power, right? Rights can be powers that allow me to do things like vote or to run for elected office or to have a job. These are powers that are being granted to me that enable me to do something that perhaps I wouldn't be able to do in the absence of rights. Now this is kind of, we're going to really summarize this briefly, but a very important and ongoing debate within human rights literature is the tension between, on the one hand, universalism, and on the other hand, cultural relativism. So universalism means that what is applicable in one place should apply all across the world. So, for example, the right for women to vote. Someone who's approaching human rights from a universalist perspective would say that all women in every society, regardless of their context, should be allowed the right to vote. Now that's different from what's known as a cultural relativist position. In a cultural relativist position, someone is taking the stance that what we have to focus on is the context in which this right is being discussed. So using that same example of women's suffrage or women's right to vote in an election, a cultural relativist might look at a country that restricts women's rights, like say Saudi Arabia or Iran, and say that, well, we can't judge that society. They have chosen their own path, their own direction. And so it's not our right to tell other countries what to do and what kinds of rights they should have on the books and what classes of individuals they should apply to. So in short, a universalist says rights apply to everyone everywhere. Cultural relativists say, no, we need to pay attention to specific cultures and understand that they have reasons for adopting the kinds of rules and policies that they have on the books. Human rights have been talked about for eons, and they have been identified not only as a matter of philosophy, but they also come from different traditions. There is evidence to suggest that human rights were talked about in religious texts. In particular, this idea that if humans are made in the image of God, and we are to respect God, then that means we should be given certain kinds of rights that enable us to achieve our maximum potential. So religion has had quite a bit to say about the role of human rights throughout history. Natural law is this idea that just by virtue of us being born, we are inherently bestowed with certain kinds of rights that no one can take away from us. So what makes us different is that we are humans, but once we are born into the world, we are automatically given certain kinds of rights. And then a kind of third wave of development of human rights says that, well, some rights are not inherent, some rights are not taken from religious scripture, some rights are made by states. States tell us what are the rights that we should and shouldn't have. So that's why we have differences in laws, differences in the rights that are adopted in national constitutions. States are legislating the kinds of human rights that they think are pertinent to their own society. And we also have different ways in which we can slice human rights. There are different kinds of rights that we will talk about very briefly here. So there's kind of three waves of human rights that track onto some of the most important treaties of human rights throughout the 20th century. So on the one hand, we have the first wave, or civil and political rights. And these largely deal with the interactions that humans have with their state. So they afford individuals the right to vote, the right to run for elected office, the right to have freedom of speech, and those freedom to assemble, those kinds of things. That was complemented by a second wave, which is known as the group of economic, social, and cultural rights. And these speak to the importance of recognizing the rights of individual groups, of our status, economically speaking. So here where we have rights that pertain to, for example, the right to work, the right to earn a fair wage, the right to have adequate housing, the right to have cultural preservation. So all of these different rights are tied to what some might think as less central functions of the state itself, but nonetheless very important aspects of humanity and daily life. And then finally, some people argue that there's a third wave of human rights called solidarity human rights. And what makes these different is that they speak to kinds of human rights that require the cooperation of the entire international system in order to successfully protect. So these rights include the right to development, the right to a clean environment. And so what's really important to kind of show how this is affected practically is that if you have the right to a healthy environment, which is what I've spent a lot of my time studying, if your country protects that right, that's great. But if you have a neighboring country that pollutes directly into your country, say that there's a factory whose air mass goes right over into your country and dumps lots of acid rain and it pollutes your riverways and that kind of thing, then it doesn't matter what laws you have on the books in your country. What's going on in the other country affects the rights that your citizens in your country hope to enjoy. So it means that everyone has to agree that these are rights that should be protected in order for them to actually be implemented in practice. Another way that you can kind of examine rights is by separating them along negative and positive lines. So negative rights are rights that prohibit the government for intervening in your life in some important way. The United States Constitution is both the oldest and shortest constitution in the world, and it is chock full of negative rights. Do you think you know why that might be the case? Think about how the United States came to be and its origins, what the people who settled the United States and ultimately declared revolution were seeking in establishing a, quote, more perfect union. Well, they were seeking to have additional freedoms, religious freedom and other kinds of freedoms, that they were not being granted over in Great Britain. So the negative rights were born out of this experience of having a monarchy tell the people what to do. So the United States decided that one of the things it was going to make very clear was that we wanted to separate what the government can do from what it cannot do for the citizens who have come to the United States to enjoy a more free life. So this is why we see, our constitutional rights within the United States phrased in ways of, for example, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. That is explicitly stating something that the government cannot do to you. Now that's different from what's known as a positive right. Positive rights are rights that you are to be granted as a citizen of a particular country. So here's where you have the right to clean water, the right to adequate housing, the right to health, the right to participate in elections. These are things that the state has to guarantee you because you're a citizen. And although this is by no means an exhaustive list, some of the main treaties in human rights include the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And another really important treaty is the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Together, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights are considered to be the International Bill of Human Rights.